So I'm going to discuss facts versus values today. I'm going to use the federal deficit and debt as an example to illustrate these concepts. So, the U.S. debt exceeds $26 trillion as of July 26, 2020. From June 2019 to June 2020, the debt increased by $4.45 trillion. Part of that is actually a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic response. The U.S. owes $3.8 trillion in interest on the debt. That equals 24% of the total debt. So as the debt goes up because of spending, the debt also goes up because we pay interest on the money that we borrow to cover our spending. Our national debt now exceeds 132.6% of our GDP. That's gross domestic product, which means that the amount of federal debt exceeds the amount of money that the American economy produces in a year. Now, that's not the profit. That is the total amount of money. It doesn't separate profit from operating expenses. In other words, it would take every single penny that every single business in the U.S. made in the last year to pay off our current debt, and no money would be left to invest in economic activity in the coming year. But that's 1 year. It exceeds 100%, so the following year, 33% of that year's GDP also would have to go in just to make us even. So most economists think that this ratio should not exceed 60%. So we have far exceeded that at this point. Share of the debt per person, per citizen, is $80,508. Now, that was for 2020, and the reality is not every citizen pays taxes. And so let's just focus on the taxpayers. Their obligation is $213,277, an extraordinary amount of money. Most of us do not have that kind of income per year. So the 2020 federal government budgeted $4.79 trillion, but will only receive $3.7 trillion in tax receipts. Now, that was a calculation made before the pandemic, and we all know that our economic activity has dipped during this time. So these numbers, they give you an idea of some of the magnitude of the problem, but because of the pandemic, we can't be entirely accurate. It's going to look a lot worse, actually. So some economists warn that our debt will increase substantially in the future because of unfunded liabilities. These are payments that the government has promised to people like Social Security, Medicare, military and civilian pensions. This unfunded liability will be $73 trillion in the next 75 years if you subtract the promised payments from the actual taxes collected for that purpose. So we will still owe $73 trillion even though we're collecting money on that obligation. Now, others claim that this will not happen because the economy and future tax collection will align. Increasingly at the state and local level, some governments are facing great difficulty paying for promised pensions of state workers because politicians have failed to set aside sufficient money to cover those liabilities. This is a problem that tells you that even though we're focused on the federal government, that's only a portion of the total problem for this country. So I have a chart here, a graph that shows you the historical U.S. debt to GDP ratio. And I read an article a few days ago, and it said that we have reached the point that we were at following World War II, at a time where we had a lot of great outlays to cover expenses for fighting World War II. So you can see that it's just this long, continuous upward trend, unfortunately. The other thing is, you should note, is that this is not just a problem here in the United States. In fact, Greece a few years ago actually had to go under financially. They had some great economic disruption to their economy because their debt had become so high that they defaulted on their loans that they had taken out around the world. Now you can see that the United States has incredible debt, but you can see our neighbor to the north, Canada, does too. Much of Western Europe, see in Africa, and we can see in India. And it's hard to see the Middle East there. Obviously, we can see Italy and Greece as well. So it is a worldwide problem as well. And here's the big issue. So we're borrowing money. We're borrowing it from other countries, for example. Some of it comes from money that we borrowed from other countries. Japan and China are the greatest holders of our debt. But think about how this affects our foreign relations with these countries. China has continuously adopted a very expansionist stance, and the current president has tried to rein that in some fashion. But part of the danger is if you get too forceful with China, will they call us on that debt and demand immediate payment? And so it affects foreign policy when we owe other countries money. So facts are generally agreed upon, and they can be verified in ways that are not particularly controversial. Gave you a bunch of numbers. Now, how we evaluate those facts starts the process going here. It refers to the relationships that are implicit in the facts. The evaluation embodies the evaluative content of the facts much more explicitly, since the explanation offered has obvious policy implications. Now, some economists believe that a state's debt should not exceed 60% of GDP, as I said before. To do so is to destabilize that economy. They may cite other states such as Greece, Italy, and Spain as examples of states whose economies have become destabilized because they have failed to maintain their national debt within these parameters. These economists would evaluate the fact that the U.S. debt is now 132% of its GDP to mean that the U.S. economy has moved into some very dangerous territory. I am going to end this section of the recording, and I will finish the lecture in the next section.